We have already had an introduction to much of my talk from my much better half's presentation just before this. I've taken the liberty to change the title just a little bit in order to better reflect the modalities that we have been using, which include 3D tensor, tensor rate, diffusion tensor imaging. These are all modalities of MR imaging combined with histology to look at the age-related changes in the human musculoskeletal system. So one of our advantages is, or our strengths is that we look at the human body in vivo, and therefore we can follow longitudinally with a very safe technique, which is MRI. Now, throughout this conference, there have been several talks which have emphasized the importance of dynapenia, that is, the disproportionate loss of force compared with the loss of lean muscle mass. And various agents have been speculated in terms of explaining away that loss in force, such as neural as well as the molecular pathways were the ones that were emphasized till now. The ones that we want to focus on is the remodeling of the extracellular matrix as a person ages, because we suspect that this causes a change in the lateral force transmission, something that we think is a big factor in reducing the loss of force as a person ages. There have been animal experiments which have shown that as much as 80% of the force transmitted is through this lateral force transmission. Only 20% is longitudinal via the muscle, longitudinal aspect of the muscle fibers. So one of the aims that we want to focus on is to find a surrogate marker of this lateral transmission force transmitter, and we utilize MRI for that purpose. Again, in some of the talks you would have actually seen part of this slide in which we have, again the resolution is probably not that great, but oh, it's not showing up there. So what we have is in the middle top row is mapping of the adipose tissue separately from the muscle, and on the right hand side of that matrix is the connective tissue. The connective tissue is actually visualized by using a rather elegant technique of MRI, specialized one called UTS, or ultra short echo time, and this enables one to look at enables one to look at semi-solid substances such as cartilage and so on. And what you see from this probe is that there's a lot more of this green indicates the extracellular matrix elements, and it's much more of that, I don't know if you can really see it, in the senior subject compared with the younger one. And here's a 3D volume rendition of the distribution of the extracellular matrix in the lower calf muscle. These bar graphs show that in seniors, there's a much greater extent of adipose tissue in the different muscle compartments. Adipose tissue out here, connective tissue out here, both of these non-contractile elements increase in volume as a person ages, and therefore reduces the force generating capacity of the muscle. As Usha had pointed out, we use this technique of velocity encoded phase contrast imaging, which in every pixel of the MR image that you have maps the velocity of that the protons in that pixel rather than the typical T1 and T2 properties that a radiologist would be looking at. And what that enables us to do as you follow from one phase to the other is to map out the track of that particular pixel, compute strains, strain rate, and so on. But one of the problems is, as Usha pointed out, MRI image taking takes a finite amount of time. About 2.5 minutes, and that's not really the problem. The problem is, in order to acquire, an imperative is that the person has to exert, as she pointed out, 70 to 128 contractions. It could be isometric, eccentric, or plantar flexion, and this, of course, is tiresome. Frail senior subjects may not even be able to achieve that high level as Marco's last question was alluding to. So one of our drive was to devise ways to reduce the number of contraction a subject is expected to give, so that you can take or go to higher percentage of MVCs, particularly old frail subjects, pardon me, senior frail subjects. All right. So the objective for this study, therefore, is to find out the strain and strain rate, as was given in the last talk, in young and senior subjects in different muscle groups at different percentages of MVC. And we use a particular technique. It's complicated but elegant, called compressed sensing. And by means of that, the number of exertions or phase encoding lines, as it's known as in the Fourier transform MRI world, that is reduced from our previous 128 or 70 down to as low as 18 to 20 contractions. All right, so previously we had done 2D within using this 2D plus time variation, that is, we call that 3D compressed sensing technique. We had looked at 22 subjects with a distribution of 12 and 10, 12 young and 10 senior, and at different MVCs, and this is part of the results, but the MVC, as you could expect, was significantly lower in senior subjects by as much as 45% compared with the younger subjects. We also did the diffusion weighted imaging. We'll go into that shortly. And we also did this 4D in which we imaged it in a 4-dimensional part. So one of the other advantages of doing 3D is in the 2D slice that Usha was describing, and what has been the content of our papers till now, you take a single slice. So you do not have information for through plane movement of the trajectories, and there might be such movement. So, and also the fibers may not conveniently lie in that plane. They may go out there. That's why most of our work has focused on the MG, because you can carefully choose a slice in which you have the fibers lying in that plane, and you can complete the analysis that way. But in the soleus and more complex muscles, you don't have that privilege. So it's much better to have a 3D imaging, but it also takes a lot of time. Therefore, you have to devise ways to reduce this. Usha has already gone over this. I'm not going to go over it again, but one thing I might want to point out is, you see these spikes out here? That's from differentiating the force curve that the subject exerts, and these spikes are equivalent to the R wave in an EKG trace, and it fools the MRI scanner into believing that we are doing a cardiac scan. Why do we want to do that? In those 70 to 128 contractions, if you average them, you have this force curve, and within each of those force curves, we take about 22 different views and play them back in a cine. You'll see examples of that. In this, again, is the same thing. So phase contrast image out here, as I said, each of the pixel grayscales represents the velocity. We put regions of interest in the medial gastrocs and the soleus and start analyzing. Again, this part has been dealt with Usha as well. Essentially, what we look at is the strain, the major part of the strain, and the surprising thing, as Usha pointed out, was you'd expect if a fiber contracts that the main strain will be along the direction of the fiber. It ain't so. It deviates away from that. Why does it do so? Well, because it's connected by this extracellular matrix to its adjacent fibers, and therefore instead of the force being transmitted along the fiber, it deviates away from that by this angle that you see out there, SR fiber angle, a theta. So the direction of the maximum strain deviates away from the axis of the fiber, and the other two parameters that you have are the in-plane strain and the through plane strain. So those are parameters that we look at, and this is the thing that we wanted to emphasize. You can look at this data either in terms of the principal values that you get in terms of the maximum strain, or you can get the projections along the fiber direction. It's a mathematical tensorial operation. And within that, one other thing that you get is the shear strain. Now, shear strain is like if you have a block of rubber and have the bottom fixed or adhered to a table and move the upper part, that's shear strain. And that's what happens with that. We speculate this small thing was what Usha was referring to, a rectangular parallelepiped that starts changing shape. Shear strain, that's what we believe is the mechanism behind the lateral force transmission, and which starts changing with age because the extracellular matrix starts coming into play. We also put in at the beginning, we had found the fiber angle or fiber track from imaging the fatty fascicles, suppressing water and just looking at the fat that separates fascicles. That was our indication of the direction of the fibers. Instead, a more scientific way of doing that would be diffusion tensor imaging. This is a very elegant technique by which you can actually literally track the fibers and their paths, and from that you know all that you almost need to know about that fiber direction. We had other assessments, physical, including anthropometrics, height, weight, BMI, age, sex, race, hand grip, that is the force, chair stand time, timing for 200 meters and 400 meters walk. We also took the systolic blood pressure and diastolic blood pressure. Is Dr. Liebenberg out here? So in his talk, he had tried to correlate the breaking of strands with I believe it was the 400-meter walk, or so. These kinds of gross measures are, of course, way downstream, whereas much more upstream parameter to measure and connect with things that are changing at a molecular level would be things like force and fiber strains and so on. We also did a histology. This was done by one of our colleagues in University of California at Davis. He quantified the amount of different types of collagen: 1, 3, 4, 5, and 6. All right, so please remember all those things that we had done. This is one of our favorite slides. What this shows is a comparison between young and senior, okay? And within that young and senior, we are looking at these strain parameters, strain rate parameters, as the force has been varied as shown out here. The force is changing from 30, 40 to 60% MVC. And then we are looking at how these two parameters, peak strains and peak strain rates, change with differing percentages of MVC. What we see is overall, with increase of force, both in young and seniors, these parameters, they increase, okay? Sorry, they decrease with as you go from young to senior. Oh, and each of these rows, again, this was explained to some extent by Usha, they refer to that S fiber in plane, through plane, and then the shear part, which is the important one, which is this lowest one. And what you see out here, if you compare this with this one, is that there is a general decrease. If you compare the peak strains in the young with the peak strains in the seniors, in the corresponding figures, there will again be a general decrease. General decrease is fine, but then you look for statistical significance, and if you look at that, what you'd see is that with age, significant changes are seen both in soleus and in MG with these parameters. And within that is the maximum shear strains for both the soleus and the MG. In other words, with age, we see that with statistical correlation, there's a definite decrease in these in this parameter along with the principal strain. With force level, we see only with the MG. Which is not to say that in the soleus it doesn't increase with increasing force level. It does, but we get statistical significance only in the MG or with force level with the shear strain. So it comes out that the maximum shear strain is a very important parameter. That's that bending of a rectangular solid object. And similar analysis with that you saw that slide with all these different other parameters, anthropomorphic and the collagen content. We saw that the collagen 6 had a significant correlation with several strain and strain rate indices, maximum shear strain both in the MG as well as in the soleus. One other part of it was the diastolic blood pressure. That also correlated with a whole bunch of other things, but mostly with the shear strain rate, both in the medial gastrocs and the soleus. Again, shear strain is coming out to be the maximum occurrence. All right. The other important part is the 4D that we told you that we are doing a 3D scan. Instead of one slice, we are doing a whole series of slices so that you can now have information for through plane variation and trajectories. What we see are the following things. So if the fiber contracts, the first row denotes that. It's contracting and it goes to negative value. This is in one muscle MG and this is in the soleus. In the perpendicular cross section, so if you can imagine, the imaging plane is this axis, this horizontal axis, and a horizontal plane which includes the fiber. So that's the imaging plane. Within that plane, along the fiber, this one decreases as the fiber contracts, and this portion of it is this row, and it increases. So as the fiber contracts, the other side increases, which is to be expected. What was also very prominent in all the muscle levels, force levels, as well as in all the subjects, is the through plane increase was almost zero. So we have these three different possibilities in which both the through plane and the in plane direction increase, as you can see this outer layer, or one increases, the other decreases. And in the third case would be one side remains constant, the other increases. And this is what essentially is indicated by a combination of these two figures. And what that indicates basically is the presence of something like costomeres which restrict that motion. Here's a cine which shows the contraction along the fiber direction, the first row in the previous slide, and increase in the direction of the fiber, the third row in the previous slide, and this is the shear strain. Now, this one is expansion, so you'll see it in red. This one is contraction, so you'll see the peak in blue, and they are exactly in sync. And whereas this one is halfway in that force curve, if you remember one of the earlier slides, that's what shows out here. These are different parameters that you can analyze and get, and basically we do a regression analysis with all those parameters to see which one of them correlate with the force variation as the person ages. All right, so in terms of conclusions and discussions, methodologically we were able to develop this sequence which allowed us to have the patient exert only as many as maybe 18 to 20 contractions in comparison to 70, so even old senior subjects can go up to 60% MVC. We were also able to see through plane information. So this is the first report of 3D strain and strain imaging in the principal fiber frame. The maximum shear strain is used since that is independent of the frame of reference. One quick thing is, and this is pretty obvious, we see that the maximum changes in the soleus occurs in the low MVC domain, whereas the maximum changes in the gastrocnemius occurs in the higher MVC system. That's because of the preponderance of type 1 fast versus type 2 types of fibers, and we see that in our results. Importantly, the significant changes with age are in the shear strain in both the muscle compartments and in the in-plane only in the MG. In the other side also it is there, but in the soleus, but not statistically too significant. This must be connected therefore with a stiffer ECM as the person ages that restricts radial expansion, limiting longitudinal. So in order to expand longitudinally, it must have enough latitude in the cross direction to contract, and that doesn't happen with the ECM or the ECM remodeling, and therefore shear strain is a potential surrogate marker of lateral transmission of force. This reduced shear strain or SR with age implies reduced lateral transmission of force, and therefore we suspect that we can use this as a surrogate marker for LTF. We also have done a lot of computational modeling, and in that we can predict that the shearing of the endomysium, you remember that that fiber diagram that we had given, of the endomysium as the most likely pathway for transmission of force generated by non-spanning muscle fibers that are not attached to the tendon. Dr. Abigail Mackay had given a talk on the MTJ, the muscle tendinous junction, and in that she had shown these cells impinging into the tendon. This mischief occurs much more upstream in the actual bulk of the muscle, in which you have non-terminating, that is the muscle fibers don't start with from the aponeurosis of origin and end in the aponeurosis of insertion. They basically end in between, and there's a lot of muscle fibers like that, and there's a very good paper by Sylvia Blemker on a computational modeling on that, and the lateral force transmission is one way of explaining that. Similarly, the out-of-plane strain, across the board, we see it's a magnitude less than the other two directions. I'm almost on the last slide. The histology with the 6, so the collagen 6 is what we seem to, our hypothesis seems to be borne out by that. That is the shear strain, or a measure of the shear in the endomysium, and which is therefore responsible for the lateral transmission of force. And therefore, we have a causal link. I mean, that's critical. It's just not statistical correlation between different parameters and what is observed, but a causal link between the two. With the diastolic blood pressure, I would probably not emphasize too much. It's a little hand waving, so I'm going to skip that and end with the acknowledgement to Hugo and all the other organizers, as he insists that we say. Thank you.
Thank you, Shantanu. We have time for a question. Questions from the audience? Well, we have no question, then just a comment about this technique and the potentiality that this has for following the patients, let's say during training or something, because the fact that you can see the different type of tissue, the substitution of the muscle fibers with connective tissue of others, and then following them during training, maybe this will be fantastic.
Exactly. I mean, it's totally safe, no ionizing radiation, so you can follow it up to your heart's content. Yes, that's right.
Oh, there is
Marcus,
a question
yes.
from Marco.
Shantanu, from your calculations, you went up to 50% of 60% of MVC.
60%, yes.
What was the percentage of force which was lost through lateral displacement?
I mean, the reduction was 45%, comparing seniors with the younger subjects. So one would presume, again, the point is that that reduction is not entirely because of lateral force transmission, but neural factors and other molecular pathway factors that had been talked about. We don't know. I mean, we have done computational modeling, and in that, we have figures up to even 20% of that is due to the lateral force transmission reduction from remodeling of the extracellular matrix. So we have concomitantly parallel computation modeling that goes on with each of these pieces of work.
Okay, thank you.